Okay. Hello everyone. October 2nd. Um, I decided that, as I've said, I wanted to not skip ahead necessarily, but to summarize Hudson. Apparently, by the end of today, there would have still been 10 damn chapters left in the Hudson book, as short as they are. So what I decided to do today is there's a logical breakpoint after chapter 17. So I'll read 17 today, partially because it will convince me, maybe completely, that Obama's a class traitor or something, and will disabuse me of any historical support I might have for Barack Obama, which is unfortunate. But at the end of chapter 17, I hope that you'll probably agree with me that I hope that you'll agree with me that Obama still was another example of regulatory capture. It's not like he was a hostage or anything, but I think it's fairly obvious that he was surrounded or hemmed in by Clintonistas. And and I guess by the time you get to end of 17, you may agree with me that Timothy Geithner needs to be hauled in front of Congress and perhaps well, if not pilloried there, some sort of um, prosecution by DOJ. I mean, if I were president, but anyway, if I'm not going to be, so that's another deal. Although, if you were going to press Kamala on being a prosecutor, I think it would be a useful, if even if it were a show trial, to take a bunch of banksters and maybe even a Fed chair, a former Fed chair or something, and uh, prosecute them or somehow make an example of them at the front end of the administration. That's what I would do, because you're looking, assuming that Harris wins, you're looking at 8 years of a really a good opportunity to move the United States into a better position. But hope springs eternal, and perhaps by the end of after having that little Cuba presentation last night, you sort of wonder, what the hell are we doing? Anyway, Michael Hudson, chapter 17. So tomorrow I'm going to skip ahead to chapter 29. And all those chapters are available, so you can read them for yourself. But as I said, chapter 17 is a sort of natural end, because Hudson switches over to use the last 10 chapters before the conclusion to discuss implications for Europe. And that's making me an American exceptionalist on the one hand. On the other hand, you would probably be bored to tears by my summary of those 10 chapters. But even though I did sort of do it, I want to skip ahead, because the 29th chapter of Hudson outlines exactly the way forward. That is, if there were things that we were going to do to move a global economy, much less the U.S. economy, towards some sort of more socialist solution, one that would, or a more anti-capitalist solution, those would be it. Hudson, I think, does a good job of identifying what all has to change. From a structural point of view, needless to say, you have to get down to the details of, what you have to do, and of course there will be resistance. Wall Street takes control and blocks debt write-downs. The president, that is Obama, chose his team, and when there was only so much time and only so much money to go around, the president's team chose Wall Street. Obviously, Wall Street, not Main Street, which was, for Elizabeth Warren, her own kind of set of issues that ultimately comes up yet again during the 2020 election primary season. Needless to say, that was made it problematic for Bernie, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're stuck with a certain type of Democratic Party politics. Voters in modern democracies tend to support politicians who draw the most beautiful pictures of how a fair and prosperous economy would operate. The more clearly a candidate can vocalize popular desires for upward mobility, lower living costs, and deterrence of fraud and greed, the more likely they are to be elected. As the quip attributed to George Burns, Groucho Marx, and others puts it, the secret of life is sincerity and fair dealing. If you can fake that, you've got it made. It's pretty much a Donald Trump deal, although Trump is far from sincere. What voters wanted in the U.S. 2008 presidential election was a change away from multi-billion-dollar gifts to Wall Street and the Cheney-Bush foreign military adventures. Barack Obama presented himself as the hope and change candidate. In an atmosphere sharped largely by public anger at the bailouts, he and other Democrats spoke of writing down mortgages for underwater homeowners, rolling back bank salaries and bonuses, and re-empowering the regulatory agencies that the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations had gutted. And remember that this includes the Clinton administration. Congress had not written any of this into its TARP legislation or pressured government agencies to limit how banks could spend the giveaways they received. The hope was that this would change with a strong voter mandate that gave Democrats control of the House of Representatives and Senate, as well as the presidency. The political path was open to enact far-reaching reforms. Obama quickly slammed the door shut. Although having run on a populist platform, his role was to deliver his Democratic Party's liberal constituency of urban labor, racial and ethnic minorities, environmentalists, and anti-war advocates to his campaign contributors. Over the past half century, the Democratic Party's strategy has been to create a menu of promises in two columns. Column A reflects the hopes and changes that voters want. That is the platform on which the Democrats ran and still run. Column B represent what the party's major contributors and lobbyists want. Obama won the election by verbalizing the hopes of the 99%, but did in practice what his campaign backers from the 1% wanted. His language was populist, his policies oligarchic, and aimed to prevent change. And I'll break here for the second. There is an entire literature on the black bourgeoisie, and however you want to describe it and deal with it. And it's this incredibly interesting black left literature on critiquing those issues. And I refer you to that kind of literature to sort of work through how sort of assimilative theory about the American melting pot needs to be more radically critiqued in this presently intersectional age. Adept at applying this about face with grace and a smile, Obama named former investment banker Rahm Emanuel his chief of staff to stifle the party's left wing, and appointed Clinton's old Rubenomics gang to key policy positions headed by Larry Summers as chief economic advisor and Geithner at Treasury to block bank regulation or debt write-downs. Instead of responding to public aspirations to appoint regulators of Wall Street, the top administrative bureaucracy was drawn largely from Goldman Sachs and Citigroup, excluding anybody as truly regulatory as the Bush administration's Sheila Bair or Neil Barofsky. I might note, I'll break at this moment to tell you that it's not quite the same, with Janet Yellen at Treasury, but I would assert to you that some things do need to change. And it's not like we want to destroy the Fed or whatever, but it does seem to me that Harris would do well to clean the slate. Post-2008 economic policy began that of campaign contributors who comprised the Wall Street Finance Democratic Leadership Council, i.e. Third Way, under Clinton. The continuity runs from Clinton to Obama administrations via the economic policies of Summers and Jack Lew, another Rubin colleague. At the Justice Department, Eric Holder and Lanny Brewer blocked prosecution of bankers and pulled funding from FBI or Securities and Exchange Commission investigators of financial and corporate fraud. Obama's naming of a Wall Street-approved cabinet showed his intention to block the reforms that most voters backed and expected, headed by debt relief. What voters got after 2008 was a financialized deep state concentrating more wealth in Wall Street's hands. No follow-through on Obama's airy talk of raising the minimum wage, Jesus, and a drive to reduce the federal budget deficit at the expense of Social Security and other New Deal economic programs instead of public spending to fuel recovery. I'll break here for the moment to remind you that some of this capture of Obama is also Biden. Biden is part of this as well, with all due respect. The MERS, M-E-R-S, Mortgage Electronic Registration System scandal unfolded with zero government protection of homeowners against false bank documentation of just who owned the mortgages and how much was owed. Just how remarkable a feat this subversion of regulatory cleanup was is reflected in the fact that by April 2009, TARP Inspector General Borofsky had opened 20 criminal fraud investigations into the $700 billion program and its cash for trash dumping of junk mortgages on the Fed and Treasury. An early report sharply criticized the government for failing to hold financial institutions accountable for the money they were given. Charging that the plan carries significant fraud risks, the Inspector General's report pointed out that almost all of the risk in this new trillion-dollar plan is being borne by the taxpayers. The so-called private investors would be able to put up money they borrowed from the Fed through non-recourse loans, meaning that if the toxic assets that were purchased proved too toxic and the scheme failed, the private investors could just walk away without repaying the Fed for those loans. The government is purchasing the most suspect of the bank's mortgage packages. Geithner's undercutting of TARP showed that despite protests from Congress and the public, Wall Street could still get away with theft. Refusing to enforce reforms, Geithner became bolder as he saw his actions backed by President Obama, Chief of Staff Emanuel, and Democratic congressional leaders. Former IMF economist Simon Johnson observed that troubled banks usually are cleaned up as a condition of official assistance, either by being forced to make management changes or being forced to deal with their bad assets. This was the approach favored by Ms. Baer when she was at the FDIC. This was the approach, the idea that there were no alternative to Mr. Geithner's approach simply does not hold water. Next section, Obama's false promise to write down bad mortgages. Nowhere was Geithner's unconditional support for the banks more blatant than in his neutering of President Obama's promise to reduce the debts of underwater homeowners in the Home Affordable Mortgage Program, HAMP. When $50 billion in TARP funds were committed in 2009 to help homeowners through HAMP, Obama announced his intent to help up to 4 million struggling families stay in their homes through sustainable mortgage modifications. Hundreds of billions more were still available and could have been used by the White House and the Treasury Department to help support a massive reduction in mortgage debt. In fact, as Borofsky reports in his book Bailout, the conflicts of interest baked into the program would render it ineffective unless principal reduction was made mandatory. Geithner pretended that the losses that the banks might suffer on their first and second mortgages could push them into insolvency, requiring yet another round of TARP bailouts. Instead, he insisted that lenders be compensated for their losses on liar's loans. Supported by Geithner, the banks banded together against underwater homeowners. The message was clear, Borofsky concludes. No way, no how would Treasury require principal reduction, even when Treasury's analysis indicated it would be in the best interest of the owner, investor, or guarantor of the mortgage. President Obama permitted Geithner and the Treasury to block the HAMP, H-A-M-P, derailing hopes for a housing recovery by just leaving it to the largely bank-owned mortgage servicers and to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to determine if such relief would be implemented. The effect was to leave the economy debt-ridden rather than writing down mortgages. A conflict of interest between banks and homeowners was inherent in the HAMP program. In addition to their first mortgage, Many homeowners had taken out equity loans as a second subordinated mortgage, that is, second in line to be paid in case of default. Often the same bank held both mortgages, and because first mortgages are the first in line to be repaid, secondary creditors bear the loss if a debtor defaults, which is why these second mortgages almost always bear a higher interest rate. Banks use government subsidies to write down the first mortgages for which the government reimbursed them, so that they could enable homeowners to continue paying their equity loans or other second mortgages in full. The banks thus were able to collect on liar's loans that were not subject to government reimbursement, thanks to the fact that the initial plan didn't require the banks to write down second liens they may have held, like home equity lines from borrowers whose original loans were modified. To dilute public support for writing down underwater mortgages, bankers and Geithner mounted a propaganda campaign to pit debtors against each other. Their divide and conquer ploy was characterized homeowners with negative equity, but who still had enough income to afford to pay for their mortgages as free riders. Free riders are people who, in a variety of instances, who take advantage of their position, sort of feeding off the costs borne by others. It would have paid for such individuals to walk away and buy a similar home at a lower price, leaving the banks holding the bad mortgage. But bank lobbyists and the Treasury tried to goad the homeowners into staying current on their payments, even when their mortgage debts were more than the home was worth. Warning about the moral hazard of irresponsible mortgage debtors getting a free ride, banks incited responsible borrowers to resent debtors who were offered relief for mortgages larger than the market price would cover. Baer accused Geithner of using the moral hazard argument in a one-sided way to buttress this double standard, saying that he didn't want to reward the behavior of those who knowingly got in over their heads. He had no such concern for the megabanks. Ultimately at issue, she concluded, was whether our financial system should be based on a paradigm of bailouts or one of accountability. Geithner's opposition to debt write-downs shows that instead of seeking to create a viable financial balance, the Treasury promoted a one-sided financial grab by Wall Street, leaving the economy in a debt trap. Matters got much worse when banks saw that the Geithner-Obama program enabled them to make much more money by foreclosing and running up fees and penalties than by writing down debts. What sophisticated real estate investors do when in negative equity. So what does happen? Next section. The decline in real estate prices confronted heavily mortgaged homeowners with a choice. The economic option was to walk away from their property. This is called jingle mail, for the sound made by putting the keys to the house in an envelope and mailing it or handing them back to the bank, returning the collateral pledge to back the loan. Owners who walk away from underwater property lose whatever they have put into their home, but at least free themselves from having to pay much more than it is worth. It pays to make a new start with a smaller debt, or simply to rent. The ethic of walking away from underwater real estate deals is practiced more cynically by the wealthy. Real estate investors call this strategic default. But mortgage bankers urge less affluent homeowners to take an uneconomic view of debt in terms of personal ethic of responsibility, a moral obligation to pay debts. While manipulating the moral bias of homeowners to stay put and keep paying the banks for loans in excess of the home's still falling market price, the Mortgage Banker Association was walking away from its own underwater headquarters. It had bought the 10-story glass building in Washington, D.C. was in 2007 with a $75 million mortgage. Like millions of American households, the Wall Street Journal noted, the association found itself stuck with real estate whose market value had plunged far below the amount it owed to its lenders. This story is, of course, one of hilarious hypocrisy. Having put down only 5% of the purchase price, the trade group decided to strategically default on its mortgage when the property lost $34 million, that is 40% of its value, in the declining market. Instead, the association rented offices 5 blocks away, announcing that continued ownership of the building, which was financed with $75 million of variable rate debt, would be economically imprudent. It ended up being sold for just $41.3 million. The association's CEO, John Corson, refused to confirm just how much money it saved by walking away from the property, but he urged homeowners to keep paying their loans, even if that no longer seemed to be in their economic interest, because defaults hurt neighborhoods by lowering property values. What about the message they will send to their family and their kids and their friends, he asks. Evidently, corporate personhood is not subject to the ethic urged on homeowners not to walk away from underwater property, but to forego their economic choice. The idea was for debtors to do as banks say, not as they do. Next section, the path not taken. Debt revision for underwater homeowners. There described how Geithner blocked the FDIC from taking over bad banks, keeping them under Treasury protection by crying havoc that a public takeover would crash the economy and ignite a depression. This drowned out the ability of homeownership to cope with what actually has pushed the economy into a depression, keeping the debt overhead on the books, shifting toxic waste onto the government's balance sheet, and setting the groundwork to slash Social Security, healthcare, and other social spending. Instead of ending bailouts, Geithner recruited administrators from the Fed who shared Chairman Greenspan's anti-regulatory views. Their deregulatory blueprint for reform gave him unilateral control to block real reform. For his part, Geithner criticized his nemesis, Senator Elizabeth Warren, for allegedly not understanding the nature of fairness, claiming that the central paradox of financial crises is that what feels just and fair is really the opposite of what's required for a just and fair outcome. These are not the droids you're looking for. He meant that what Wall Street claims to be fair is just the opposite of what the economy needs to recover. In his mind, what his Wall Street clientele required was a free hand in predatory lending and rent extraction, wealth creation rentier style. Warren was worried about the right things, he said, but she was better at impugning our choices as well as our integrity and competence than identifying any feasible alternatives. Geithner's job as Treasury Secretary was to ensure that there is no alternative. He was backed by President Obama, who in 2015 echoed Geithner's condescending attack on Warren when she criticized the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, proposed dismantling of public regulation and tax policy. Geithner's claim in his self-serving memoir, Stress Tests, that he did not simply serve the large banks in the way he sought to resolve the debt problem, elicited a torrent of rebukes from officials who had dealt with him. Glenn Hubbard, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in George W. Bush's administration, for instance, had joined with Columbia University professor and housing market expert Christopher Meyer to propose a plan for the incoming Obama administration late in 2008. Their proposal, that is the Hubbard-Meyer proposal, was to offer millions of Americans the ability to refinance their mortgages into lower rate loans by directing the giant government-controlled mortgage guarantors, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, to refinance the mortgages on their books into lower interest rate loans. The idea was to save Fannie and Freddie from having to write them off as bad loans while reducing mortgages to affordable market levels. This would have freed more homeowner income to spend on the economy at large. After Geithner's book came out, Hubbard told the news media that Geithner opposed the plan in 2008 and again in 2011 when there was talk of reviving it. Kim Geithner personally and actively opposed mortgage refinancing constantly. The Wall Street Journal quoted his colleague Christopher Meyer saying that it never seemed like Geithner and the administration were ever working that hard to stop foreclosures, and in fact, he never even tried. Along similar lines, in spring 2009, Illinois Senator Dick Durbin had sought to change the bankruptcy code so that homeowners who are underwater could modify their mortgages during the bankruptcy process. Durbin's aim was to reverse the unanimous 1993 pro-bank Supreme Court decision blocking homeowners from using bankruptcy as a vehicle to write down their mortgages. The problem, however, was that Congress almost always has given favorable treatment to mortgage lenders rather than to debtors. It did so in 1978 using the excuse that more security for the banks, that is, less security for borrowers, would encourage the flow of capital into the home lending market. When bankruptcy reform passed the House and Durbin proposed in April 2009 to amend the bankruptcy law to permit mortgage write-downs, the financial services industry pulled out all the stops, arguing that a right of bankruptcy for a homeowner would increase the cost of home loans, undermine the sanctity of contracts, and promote, of course, moral hazard. And of course, Obama supported the banks. Prior to the presidential election, he had said that he would back a change in the bankruptcy laws to make it easier for families to stay in their homes. But he changed his position when Geithner opposed any such change, claiming and repeating in his book Stress Test that would not be effective. Support resurfaced for the need to write down debts, whether by bankruptcy or loan renegotiation, with the publication of House of Debt by University of Chicago finance professors Amir Sufi and Atif Mian. Contra Geithner, they argue letting bankruptcy judges write down mortgages and providing an ambitious mortgage refinancing plan would have reduced foreclosures. For example, Geithner could have pushed for a policy to give bankruptcy judges the ability to write down mortgage debt in a Chapter 13 bankruptcy, a mortgage cram down. He could have also put forth an ambitious plan to allow solvent underwater homeowners to refinance into lower interest rates. Now, Geithner objected that seeking such write-downs would have further stress a crowded bankruptcy system. But in reality, the threat of cram down would have induced more out-of-court renegotiation of mortgages. Joe Nacera of the New York Times cites an email from Bayer pointing out that giving homeowners an opportunity to file for bankruptcy would prompt mortgage holders to renegotiate the debt to a level that could be paid. And Sufi blames the Obama administration's obsessive focus on savings banks that kept homeowners from being helped. Obama's advisors chose early or not to expend political capital, forcing banks to forgive mortgage debt. The tragedy was that saving the banks will not save an economy if households are left drowning in a sea of debt. There is a kind of trickle-down theory there. Anyway, next section. Geithner turns the Home Affordable HAMP mortgage program, HAMP, into a fiasco, emphasizing that Congress intended HAMP to be an essential part of the TARP bank bailouts. Borowski describes how Geithner derailed the program using demagogic ploys to stall reform, with no intention of following through on the public promises being made. That alone is actionable. But anyway, Geithner only wanted to bail out the banks, not the economy. By late 2009, it was becoming apparent that Treasury refused to hold the banks accountable for the abuses to which they subjected homeowners in the program. Less than 8% of the funds originally allocated in TARP for foreclosure relief has actually been spent. The Treasury had no intention of actually fixing the program, and Geithner refused to penalize servicers who refused to comply with the program, or for that matter, with the law. Describing the cynicism behind the HAMP program's execution, Borowski writes how Geithner told him that the plan all along had been for the banks to foreclose, but to avoid throwing underwater homes onto the market all at once. To prevent property prices from collapsing, which would have slashed the value of mortgage claims that banks held on their books, the HAMP plan was simply to delay the process by giving homeowners a false hope of having their mortgages written down. The most widely cited passage of Bailout, of the book Bailout, describes how Geithner blurted out, "We estimate that they can handle 10 million foreclosures over time," referring to the banks. This program will help foam the runway for them. You've heard this, easing the runway talk in more recently relative to inflation. By keeping the full flush of foreclosures from hitting the financial system all at the same time. That just wouldn't anyway, but anyway. Slowing the pace of foreclosures would avoid crashing the market. It also would give the largest and most troubled banks an opportunity to run up late fees and penalties against mortgaged homes. These fees were charged against the property's ultimate selling price at the debtor's expense, while slowing the pace of distressed sales and hence the decline in prices for the real estate that backed bank mortgages. Borofsky found that the Obama administration made no attempt to deliver on its preposterous claim that it would modify mortgages downward. It left the debts in place, while foreclosures proceeded at a pace chosen by the banks. Responding to Geithner's attacks in the book Stress Test, Borofsky let loose and called him the guy who was the architect of a financial crisis in one aspect from his job at the Fed. He's the one who botched the bailout in ways that have caused the untold suffering of millions of people. When someone like that comes after you, it's almost a badge of honor. Beyond Geithner, of course, was Obama himself, quickly breaking his campaign promise to extend the bailout of the banks to include rescuing underwater homeowners from the mortgage debts that remained in place as real estate prices plunged. That he cared more for Wall Street than for distressed homeowners was made clear by the Federal Reserve's move to save financial institutions holding underwater mortgage-backed securities, the MBS, mortgage-backed securities, MBS, by buying $2 trillion of these bad debts from the banks. This money could have been used to save homeowners, and with them, the neighborhoods being devastated by bank foreclosures, leaving taxes unpaid while empty houses fell into ruin. Obama's smoothness in misleading voters. Next section. One of the first books giving an intimate look inside the Obama administration, Ron Suskind's Confidence Men, reported that on March 27th, just 2 months after taking office on January 20th, 2009, the new president invited the executives of 13 leading Wall Street institutions to the White House. After listening to their arguments for why banks had to continue paying bonuses, ostensibly to get the best talent to manage their money, Obama told them, "Be careful how you make those statements, gentlemen. The public isn't buying that." He explained that only he could provide them with the political shield needed to forestall public pressure for reform, not to mention prosecution of financial fraud. "My administration is the only thing between you and the pitchforks." One leading banker attending the meeting told Suskind, "The sense of everyone after the meeting was relief. The president had us at a moment of real vulnerability. At that point, he could have ordered us to do just about anything, and we would have rolled over. But he didn't. He mostly wanted to help us out, to quell the mob." As Suskind summarizes the result, which would shape the incoming administration's policy, Obama had them scared and ready to do almost anything he said. An hour later, they were upbeat, ready to fly home and commence business as usual. Obama smoothly marketed his policies regarding Wall Street in his interview with Steve Kroft on CBS's 60 Minutes, broadcast on December 13th, 2009. Shedding crocodile tears over the fact that the bankers had not shown a lot of shame about their behavior and outsized remuneration, the president tried to gain sympathy by showing that he knew very well why voters are mad at the banks. "Well, let's see, you guys are drawing down $10, $20 million bonuses after America went through the worst economic year that it's gone through in decades, and you guys caused the problem. And we've got 10% unemployment." Voicing the feelings of most voters as if they were his own, he continued, "I did not run for office to be helping out a bunch of, fat cat bankers on Wall Street. Nothing has been more frustrating to me this year than having to salvage a financial system at great expense to taxpayers that was caused in part by completely irresponsible actions on Wall Street." But, as Borofsky pointed out, rather than being scaled down in proportion to their epic failures in risk management, compensation for the top 25 Wall Street firms in 2010 actually broke records at $135 billion. What Obama's administration did was precisely to help out the fat cat bankers on Wall Street, the ones he had invited to the White House in March, were his major campaign contributors, and his heart seemed to be with them. His interview shows that he knew just what he was doing when Geithner and other officials bailed out Wall Street institutions, quote unquote, too big to fail. There is a culture that feels that it's always making good decisions, and if it's not, then it's somebody else's fault. That has to change. And the only way to change it, obviously, because so far, at least I haven't seen a lot of shame on their part, is to make sure that we've got a regulatory system in place that prevents them from putting us in this kind of pickle again. Well, on March 13th, 2014, however, the Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Justice found that DOJ did not uniformly ensure that mortgage fraud was prioritized at a level commensurate with its public statements. For example, the Federal Bureau of Investigation Criminal Investigation Division ranked mortgage fraud as the lowest criminal threat in its lowest crime category. Additionally, we found mortgage fraud to be a low priority, or not even listed as a priority, for the FBI field offices we visited. In addition, the Inspector General reported many assistant U.S. attorneys informed us about underreporting and misclassification of mortgage fraud cases. Matters ended even worse than Borofsky had suspected. When the dust had settled by 2015, 6 years after the program's inception, a report by the government's official monitor, Christy L. Romero, showed that only 887,001 borrowers had their mortgage costs reduced. Instead of helping some 4 million borrowers get loan modifications, banks participated in the program have rejected 4 million borrowers' requests for help, or 72% of their applications since the process began. The program was merely voluntary, and banks managed to lose the paperwork on applications or otherwise stalled. Citi Mortgage, a unit of Citibank, had the worst record, rejecting 87% of borrowers applying for a loan modification. JP Morgan Chase was almost as bad, with a denial rate of 84%. Romero's report criticized the Treasury for not making sure that homeowners were not wrongfully rejected. While Geithner blocked the regulatory system from writing down debts, Attorney General Eric Holder blocked the Justice Department from making perpetrators pay for the excesses. Their mantra was that the economy needs bankers to resume lending so that borrowers can go deeper into debt, as if this really would create more jobs and restore prosperity. As President Obama put matters in his 60 Minutes interview, now that the system is stable, I think it's very important for us to get a system in place that prevents us from being lassoed to folks who are making bad decisions and benefiting from it. And what's most frustrating me now is that you've got these same banks who benefited from taxpayer assistance who are fighting tooth and nail with their lobbyists up on Wall Street or up on Capitol Hill, fighting against financial regulatory reform. But the economy still is not stable, largely because President Obama appointed deregulators precisely to lasso the financial system to folks who are making bad decisions and benefiting from it. Like Margaret Thatcher in Britain, he claimed that there was no alternative to giving bankers everything they asked for. Obama was enabled to move to the right by Wall Street loudly proclaiming that he was hurting them, not helping them. Ron Suskind explained to Jon Stewart on Comedy Central why President Obama kept Tim Geithner on as Treasury Secretary, despite his refusal to drop a plan to take over Citigroup as he was asked to do. Jon Stewart says, we keep hearing that Wall Street guys hate Obama, and my sense is, why? They've had it as good as anybody in this country over these past 2.5 years, probably better. What's their beef in this? Well, Ron Suskind says, well, that's interesting. I asked the same question. I talked to a senior Wall Street guy and said, what gives it with this thing with Obama? You know, you're after him. He's anti-business. You know, God, he couldn't have done more. He basically opened the federal purse for you guys. He saved your skin. And he says, no, you see, he's not anti-business. But when we say he's anti-business, he just ends up doing more for us. So we're going to keep on saying it. New section, the road to debt peonage. Bankers' product is debt. They promote the cover story that lending on easier terms, that is, larger loans against income and property values, will widen the market for home ownership. There's no doubt that liar's loans, fraudulent property appraisals, and restrictions on debtors' access to bankruptcy relief enable more people to get the credit needed to buy homes. But to the extent that the economy-wide effect of such looser credit terms is to bid up real estate prices, homeowners are obliged to go even further into debt to obtain housing. Banks end up with the lion's share of real estate rental value, which is paid out as interest. Mortgage credit becomes predatory when it is not created with safeguards to keep loans within the reasonable ability of homeowners to pay. The old guideline was 25% of the borrower's income. Easy bank credit turns the security of home ownership into debt-ridden austerity, and hence chronic financial insecurity. This is the situation into which the U.S. economy has been pushed today. A similar proliferation of real estate debt has forced Eurozone economies into debt deflation and austerity. On both continents, the cost of irresponsible lending is being borne by the borrowers, and behind them, taxpayers, not the lenders. Limiting the safety valves of bankruptcy and debt write-downs, there is no opportunity to bring bank loans in line with the ability to pay. What appears at first glance to be credit to enable people to buy homes thus becomes a lifetime claim on a widening swath of their earnings. That's the bank's marketing plan, to siphon off the benefits of rising wages and salaries as debt service, preventing this income from ever being used to raise living standards. Without a jingle mail, banks will lend beyond the value of the collateral being pledged, intending to come after the debtor's overall income and that of cosigners, as in the case of most student loans, and failing that, to make taxpayers pay for their losses. This public liability for bad bank loans is what wrecked Ireland and other Eurozone countries. And this chapter closes on what is an entire section. And I'm, being an American exceptionalist, I'm going to skip over this to go to chapter 29. But the remaining chapters of this book, that is 18 through 28, describe the oligarchic strategy of bankers in what has become a class war against labor and the economy, using foreign debt pressure on governments to privatize and untax resource rent extraction. Now, that compresses in one little paragraph really a complete capitalist plan, and a plan that does not serve the 99%. It's designed to serve the 1%. So I'm at the end of my little yammering here. As I said, tomorrow I anticipate, and of course you can always go and read the whole damn thing yourself. Chapters 18 through 28, but I'm going to read completely chapter 29 because I think it summarizes and prescribes kind of the plan for the future, what all this finagling and exploitation, truly exploitation, is resulting in. And I would assert, much like chapter 29, is that we're really truly no better off, it's getting worse, and constrained by things, as I've suggested before, like a climate crisis and a variety of other oligarchic moves. There's a lot to fix. So that's my finishing my yammering. And so let's see if there's chat. Yes, it's Obama's fault. I'm going to blame, as I say, I think Obama suffers from being the first black guy, because I think that's kind of a problem that he had to bear with all of his benefactors, particularly with respect a clique, if you will, sort of centrist Democrats that go all the way back through the Clinton administration. And and I'm being sort of an apologist for Obama on the one hand, but he's only the president, and there are a lot more capitalists behind that, much like the current problem I think that we'll see with the Harris-Walz administration, that it is, if the system can be redesigned, as Hudson suggests, and I think we can do this, and it requires, I think, sending these type of books to one's legislators. I'm planning on sending a PDF copy to my legislator, saying, well, I don't think you're going to read the whole damn thing, but I truly hope that you have a different position than on this, and perhaps one that's more attuned with more progressive member. I mean, he is a progressive, but I'm going to say more progressive members of the party. So that's just what I'm going to do. It's a very minor thing, but I assume that his chief of staff or somebody who's going to read it and maybe move a little farther forward. Um,
Oh, very good.
that's the best I can do, I think, in an election year. And the Democratic Socialists do not have a candidate against him, so there's really nowhere for me to. There was nowhere for me to go from an election point of view, and I'm certainly not going to vote for a Republican, particularly in my state. It's just stupid.
It's like the next chapter is from democracy to oligarchy, and one guy can be an oligarch, but he can't be an oligarchy.
Indeed. No one man is an oligarchy. Um, and we don't talk enough we don't characterize corporate people in the United States as oligarchs, and yet we should. Uh, uh,
Yeah, well, at least
Elon Musk is an oligarch. Jeff Bezos is an oligarch. Several key members of the Democratic Party who tried to run for president at various moments. What's his name at Howard? What's his name at the Starbucks? He's an oligarch. So whatever.
well, I would offer that these giant corporations are sort of operating like oligarchs too.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Big
If you want to,
banks,
yeah, go ahead.
the big banks, Citigroup and such.
Yes. I mean, the fact that the White House, is essentially for the last decade been a tool of Goldman Sachs, whatever, is just problematic at its very base. I mean, if anything, there would have been or should have been a congressional oversight on those kinds of issues. Or, if you actually, rather than having it captive, the SEC and a bunch of other oversight things should have been, beefed up. Now,
Yeah.
the economy might have been less productive by X%, but in the long run, it would have been better for the nation. That's the trade-off against which all of this is happening, right?
Yeah, both in like the economy would be better, and then fewer people would be suffering.
Yes. I mean, the simplest argument that can be made is that everybody in the United States can be housed, period.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just it.
Yeah.
There should be
No,
nobody should be unhoused in the United States of America, period.
They got houses for cats in Iran. I mean, in a
Yeah, the Turkish cats.
Yeah.
I mean, Christ.
no, I mean, I remember all of this from the 2008 crisis, and I remember how quickly it turned from, oh, they're not rescuing anybody, they're rescuing the banks. And yes, I remember all the crocodile tears from Obama and all this bullshit. And the reality is that, and then basically it basically led the way for Trump, because 8 years later, it was all about how incredibly slow the recovery was, sluggish recovery and all that. Well, the recovery was sluggish because we didn't give them any money. The people were saddled with debt, and they weren't bailed. The human beings weren't bailed out. It's exactly the opposite of what we did after COVID, which is basically just throw money at people.
Yeah.
And they're, I'm sorry, but yes, so maybe 30% of that PPP loans and all that shit was corrupt. I don't know, but it basically made the economy recover in less than half the time.
Right. Exactly.
And yeah, I mean, Obama was completely captured by, I mean, it is essentially regulatory capture. I mean, all of government is now, and I think the 2008 crisis really was the beginning of full regulatory capture of the United States government by the financial sector of,
Yep.
Essentially it's completely owned by the financial sector, which is why Trump is so successful, because he knows that all those people are behind him financially. So.
And since he's the king of debt, he's always beholden to that sector. That sector is always,
absolutely.
I mean, there's no way that he can resist them. And then he's got the Russians on the other side. So, it's all this stuff.
Yeah. What is it about you owe $1,000 to the bank, and you have a problem. You owe $100 million to the bank, and the bank has a problem.
Indeed. Let's see. Okay, I've outlined the kind of the way the reading's going to go. Thursday, I'll do 29. Try and summarize what's in between that. But chapter 29 is a reasonable little summary of the whole book and points the way forward. And you probably derive a question for the man himself, that is Michael Hudson, when he appears in Class Unity on the 10th of October. Lapavitas, or whatever his name is, will be in Class Unity on the 6th, which I think is the regular time. And so we're at the end of the Class Unity thing, so we can have discussions about, where to go with whatever dis and dat I'm going to move to in the future. I can apologize for what I did yesterday, was sort of to force myself as well as force you to sort of think about in this in Thea Rico-Francos or whatever her name is a course of kind of the things that we might be looking at, or at least the things I'm going to look at in dis and dat, and that is certain as she refers to it, geoeconomic things, and however you want to describe them. But it's going to be a combination of those things as we move forward. It's not going to follow her syllabus, certainly, but I'm going to sort of kind of look at it as a kind of parallel, because I can pick Mark's stuff that fits into that all the way down the road, which will be hopefully useful for everyone, and for me, useful for my research stuff. So that's where we're going to go in the future. And I don't know if I'm the host again, but regardless, I'm not the host. Joe, can you eliminate the live stream, and then we could move on to other matters, because we have something that we're going to show before tonight's spirituality.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your attention. Oh, I think Joe is asleep. All right, so I will do this.
Now we can say dirty words like TARP.
Tarp, hemp.
TARP. Yes, TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program. Also something you throw over a dead body on the street when you're driving by it. That's what it was really. Don't look at this dead body of the economy. Just don't look there. Don't look there.